Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time you happen to be watching this. Hope you're having a great week. I hope that this week's videos are useful and have somehow provided a bit of knowledge about comic books and a bit of knowledge about myth. This last one, What's a Myth and Why Should We Care, covers the definitions, forms, and functions of myth and asks the question: are comic books mythology? Do they have some of the functions that myths had for people who believed in the Greek gods or the Norse gods or the Egyptian gods? As always, all borrowed images and quoted text are used for educational purposes. I began wondering, about this question when I came across lots of quotations similar to this one from a Forbes book review of all the Marvels. It talks about the modern superhero mythology. Other places talk about comics being actual myths. And I began to wonder if indeed they were. And in one of the other videos, I talk about I read my first Greek myths when I was in the third grade. I take my myths rather seriously. So I want to make sure that that naming of superhero comics as myths is accurate. The seriousness comes from a book about myths. It talks about the idea that myths were presented in ancient times, and especially for the ancient Greeks, as poems from Homer and other poets, and as plays from Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. And that the people who came to these plays saw the performances as the most profound expression of the meaning of all human life. I don't know if comics can live up to that. Certainly, comics change as they went from the books to the animated TV cartoons on Saturday mornings to the live action movies. Plot details changed, character profiles changed, but I don't know if we ever got to the most profound expression of the meaning of all human life. We'll deal with that just a little bit towards the end. C.S. Lewis wrote an essay, The Myth Become Fact, and the last sentence on this slide: I suspect that men have sometimes derived more spiritual sustenance from myths they did not believe than from the religion they professed. And again, if comics are a mythology, are they capable of providing the sustenance that myths, whether one believes them or not, are capable of providing? I should add that, in my opinion, C.S. Lewis was perhaps the greatest Christian apologist of the 20th century. So when he makes claims like this, once again, I want to take him seriously. The basic definition that we're going to work with is that myth is a traditional tale with secondary, partial reference to something of collective importance. In other words, it's a story, and that story is going to explain something that a society or a group of people believe was important. It might be as simple as, why does that rock look like a heart, to why do we have human sacrifice? I would add that traditional tales fall into, for me, two categories: the sacred, myths and parables, and the folk tales, fables, and tall tales. The myths and parables were seen as true, even though they may not have been seen as factual. The folk tales, fables, and tall tales certainly were never seen as true. No one ever believed that summer breezes came from Pecos Bill cutting up a tornado. The legends may have been factual. The people involved in the legends may have existed. I realize that for some, the stories of saints fit into that legend category. but I believe that for the most part, they were usually secular stories. The meta definition of myth: myths are stories involving gods and supernatural beings. They tell how the world came into being. They reveal the archetypes of the collective unconscious. They can do that symbolically, they can do that metaphorically. The Campbell definition about orienting people to the metaphysical dimension, explaining the origin and nature of the cosmos, validating social values, and addressing themselves to the psyche. We're going to come back to that. That, I think, is going to be the core that we're going to deal with at the end. As we continue, they're pre scientific attempts to interpret the natural world. They're functional, they're going to be science, and we're going to talk about function as well. They're enacted in ritual. They're sacred histories that are distinguished from the profane. And they may be individual, they may be social, but they are stories. They are always, always, always going to be stories. Comics, they're stories. And this week's reading has gods in them. I think you can argue that the mutants might be supernatural beings. So all of that probably is going to fit. I don't think anybody's going to buy that they're explaining to us how the world and everything in it came to be. That's not what comics do in the 20th century or the 21st century. They may deal with archetypes. Certainly, in the next section, we're going to talk about the quest archetype, and comics, along with all the action movies, fulfill the quest archetype. Is there symbolism and metaphor? Perhaps. I don't think that that's their first function. I think the first function is to see superheroes beat supervillains. But anytime you have a story, the idea that there's a symbol or that there's a metaphor certainly has to be there. And again, the mutants and the Hulk, a whole generation of people in the 60s and 70s loved the mutants, loved the Hulk because the rage and the being an outcast resonated with what they were feeling. As I said, we're coming back to this one. This is the core when we get to the tail end. The metaphysical dimension, the origin and nature of the cosmos, the social values, and addressing themselves to us, to what it means to us to be human. Continuing, I don't think anybody's going to talk about them as science. They can't interpret the natural world, and they don't function as science. We might be primitive people, but they still don't function as our science. I left they are enacted in rituals. I don't think anybody is going to reenact Iron Man's battle with the Hulk from one of the Avengers movies. At the same time, I do think that what's going to happen at cosplays or at conventions, or even the idea of going to buy books every Wednesday, has a ritualistic function. And so I'm going to leave it there as a question mark about whether or not comics meet that definition. They are not sacred histories. They are certainly distinguished from the profane, or distinguished as profane, excuse me. They are not religious myths. They are not sacred histories. They are social in scope. People can go to a Marvel movie and enjoy it together. They are individual. You can read them alone in your basement. And they are absolutely, positively stories. There's no ifs, ands, and buts about them. I mentioned the quests. Let's deal with those now. The first big idea of the quest is Campbell's monomyth. Joseph Campbell, for lack of a better phrase, wrote the book on the quest and the quest archetype. You see that there's a call to adventure, there's the refusal of the call, there's some sort of supernatural aid, there are thresholds that are crossed, There are descents into darkness. There are trials and tribulations. There are temptations. There is some sort of atonement with the Father. There's an effort to move back up. There's a desire to stay in this initiation situation. And then finally, there's a return and freedom to live. The bigger categories, the separation, the initiation, the return. In a lot of ways, these are origin stories. These are how one begins one's quest. And let's face it, those of you who are freshmen, you had a call to adventure. You came to college. You have to deal with all sorts of classes. They created some dark times. You have to now during the summer either return home, you have to deal with other situations, and now you're going to hopefully get to the point when you graduate college with the freedom to live and move on. The monomyth works because it deals with everyday situations as well as it deals with Jonah being called to preach at Nineveh and getting swallowed by a whale. The simplified version became popular a few years back, and I think is taught in several high schools. I know that teachers in my high school, when I was teaching high school, taught it as well. And it's the idea of the hero's journey, and it simplifies the call to adventure, crossing the threshold, all the stuff that Campbell broke down bit by bit, they just call challenges and temptations. The abyss is death and rebirth, and with that death and rebirth, there's a transformation, there's an atonement, and then there's a return, usually with some gift, some kind of talisman. Otto Rank's quest stages are something I've used a lot and something that I believe are an important element to take a look at comic books. I believe that these quest stages are also in dozens, if not every action adventure film you'll ever see. And if you want to see them played out, The Legend of Bagger Vance has a section where almost all of these, except for the birth, play out on screen. Heroes are often of obscure and mysterious origin. Again, if we're going to deal with comic books, Superman was born on the planet Krypton. That's pretty obscure. That's pretty mysterious. They are neither fools nor are they invincible. By fools, I think it's important here that we talk about not stupidity, but foolhardy. They do not rush in to places where they cannot win. And even if it's facing overwhelming odds, they think they have a plan that will allow them to win. And even Superman can be beaten. There's kryptonite. They are not invincible. Often the young hero is threatened and must be hidden. Daredevil was threatened because of his father and what his father was involved in, and the threat of the chemicals gave him the ability to kind of have those extra senses that allow him to be blind but still be a superhero. The hero's way is often unclear. The heroes don't always know where they're going. They don't always have a clear plan. They never know for sure how to get from point A to point B. I think we saw that in a lot of the books. Poison Ivy certainly didn't have a clear plan as she started out trying to force the human race into extinction and later just tries to get some sense of retribution for all of the people who were harming the earth. Heroes have a goal: stop the bad guy at the simplest, kill a monster in all the myths. Danger, temptation, and loneliness. Anytime you're fighting a supervillain, you've got danger, uh, hiding behind a mask, not being able to explain your secret identity. You're going to have loneliness. The hero may be accompanied by friends, servants, or disciples. I don't think Superman has any disciples, but Lois Lane, Jimmy Olsen count as friends. You saw friends as superheroes in the Devil's Reign book. You see all sorts of combinations of superheroes getting together. You see Wonder Woman uh, developing friendships or at least alliances with the gods, Lennox in the Wonder Woman book, for example. So, again, the quest stages certainly fit superhero books. The hero often has a mentor, somebody who's going to teach them. I added who may give the hero a talisman because I believe the gift is an important thing, and at least in the source that I got this from, they didn't have the talisman in there, so I think that that's just an important addition. The hero descends into darkness involving water, caves, forest, or desert. Someplace or another, there's darkness. It doesn't have to be the belly of the whale. It doesn't have to be going to hell, as Wonder Woman did. It can be something simple like a cave. The hero is changed after emerging from the descent. Hopefully, the hero has gotten better. I think Poison Ivy is an example of that. Being almost destroyed, descending into that cannibalistic stage, plant stage for a second, and then emerging looking for retribution. The symbolic nature, I think, is throughout our books, and the wounds. Wonder Woman gets wounded. Uh, Ivy gets beaten up and bloodied. Lennox in the Wonder Woman book gets wounded. Heroes get hurt. I will add that a lot of times the wounding produces a new life or some sort of big change. It comes from the castration of Uranus and the birth of Aphrodite in the myths. Superheroes have their own questing. A guy named Reynolds says that there is superhero mythology. He talks about a superhero being marked from society, not having a relationship with his parents. Batman's parents were killed. The unusual birth being separated, that seems to me to be the same sort of thing. I think that this one's important. Some of the heroes will be earthbound gods. Wonder Woman would fit that category. Poison Ivy comes pretty close to that category. Perhaps Shazam comes close to that category. Spider-Man doesn't, and yet in Devil's Reign, Spider-Man is part of that. Luke Cage is not as strong as the Hulk or the Thing or a lot of the other characters, yet he is there fighting with the earthbound deities. Justice overrides the law. You saw that with Sue in last week. The law is an ass. The ordinariness of the surroundings. The superhero is extraordinary, but in both Marvel and DC, it's the world we know. Marvel even goes a step further and puts it in New York City instead of Gotham, although Shazam was set in Philadelphia. We're looking at the real world, even though we've got somebody who says Shazam and becomes a superpowered woman. The alter ego and the taboo of not revealing the alter ego. One of the whole plot lines, as some of you pointed out in the comments, was the idea of Daredevil covering up the alter ego, getting Kingpin to forget who he was, protecting that, creating a taboo. The patriotism, we'll talk about that a little bit at the end of the presentation, but certainly the idea of Captain America, the idea of looking at Wonder Woman's outfit, there's stars and stripes in the original. Science and magic indiscriminately. I'll make a quick reference to the original Green Lantern, whose ring was based on magic. You look at the characters here. Thor is as much magic as he is science, yet he's side by side with Tony Stark / Iron Man, who is all about science. And the idea of creating a sense of wonder. And it's the ability to create a sense of wonder that I think makes something a myth. And it's going to be up to you guys to decide whether myths actually are capable, or whether comics are actually capable of creating the sense of wonder that myths create. There's also the idea that superheroines have to take a different journey, that the hero's journey and the heroine's journey is totally and completely different. Certainly, the heroine doesn't seem to be relying on guns, especially in the original comics and the original superheroines, as men do. She is trains with a witch. The Scarlet Witch in Marvel Comics trains with Agatha Harkness, and Agatha's a little bit more cruel than Obi-Wan or Dumbledore. The mate being a shapeshifter, I'm not sure that I've always gotten that, but again, to reference the Scarlet Witch, she marries Vision for a while, who's not fully human and is a full android. A lot of times, the Shadow is a killer of the innocent. That's something that's not necessarily true with heroes. And coming back to new wisdom, fully prepared for the challenges of adulthood, that again is pretty standard. But there are certainly elements, at least according to Frankel, where superheroines have an implicitly different quest. Let's sum this up. Number one, the quest is a universal archetype. Number two, comics and pop culture use the quest archetype. I think every action adventure franchise, the first couple of movies, were all about the quest archetype. Superheroes may have their own twist on the quest, and heroines may undertake a different quest than their male counterparts. The question I've got, and the question I'm not sure I ever answer fully in my own head, is the quest archetype enough to make it a myth? Or is it just a bunch of stories that don't rise to the level of wonder? And I think whenever I turn that over my head, I have to go back to the idea of functions. What are myths supposed to do? I've spoken several times about Joseph Campbell's definition, and Joseph Campbell's definition is basically functional. All of the things he's talking about are four functions. There's a mystical function. And Campbell says that the mystical function is realizing what a wonder the universe is, what a wonder you as an individual are, and experiencing awe before mystery. And he says that myth opens the world to the dimension of mystery and to the realization of the mystery that underlies all forms. This panel was not in the reading you had, it's in a couple of books later. But when Jane says, the healers are gods, and then she contrasts the gods with her as a human being, saying they underestimate the stubbornness of humans when it comes to dying. It strikes me that that is a mystery. That is an awe inducing element of humanity. We know we're going to die. Some people believe that we're the only life form on Earth that goes through the majority of its life understanding that the life will end. And yet, we have a stubbornness. We cling to every last breath. And that strikes me as a bit of a mystery and produces a lot of awe, I think, in the wonder of what humanity is. I don't think the cosmological element can fit in comic books. Even on this panel, which is psychedelic and where Thanos is going to the nexus of reality. I don't think science believes there's a nexus of reality. And this effort to create a universe of mystery doesn't square with the universe we experience. I don't think comics can fulfill the cosmological function at all. It's almost impossible. The sociological function, the patriotism of Captain America. The idea that we have the Steve Rogers Captain America, the Sentinel of Liberty. School kids all over the country take a pledge of allegiance with liberty for liberty and justice for all. We have the Sam Wilson Captain America. These books are running at the same time. The symbol of truth. Superman fighting for truth, justice, and the American way. And this is not just these recent books that came out in 2023. If you look at the third poster on here, Superman in the 1940s or early 1950s, talking about our country being made up of Americans of different races, religions, and national origins. If you talk against people because of race, religion, or national origin, it's un-American. It's validating an existing social order of the time. I think comics can do that all over the place. I think comics can react to the author's political leanings, the political debate throughout the country can be shown within the pages of a comic book. I think the sociological function is certainly possible. I don't know if that's necessarily mythical or mythological in nature, because I don't know if it does the wonder necessary, but it's there. Finally, there's the pedagogical. Teaching humans how to live a human lifetime under any circumstance. Going back to the idea of in its brevity is where life's importance lies. I've said in other classes, one of the things I believe is that one of our purposes here on earth is to learn to become human. And perhaps this is a shallow treatment of a complex situation. I'm not even going to bother to argue that. But, and in its brevity is where life's importance lies, is certainly more profound than YOLO. So perhaps the pedagogical function and the sense of wonder can happen. And I'm using the term perhaps because one of the options you have is to tell me in your essay whether or not myths fulfill some of the functions. Whether or not comics fulfill some of the functions. Whether or not comics can be myths. I think we're going to wrap it up here. Hope everybody has a good week, and we'll talk to you next week.